Look at the nasty common dog this nurse has let Francis have right in his bed. I never heard of such nerve. Call Mason. Have him put this dog out immediately." "I'll take the dog if it's to be put out," growled Dr. Parris. "I know a good dog when I see one," he muttered resentfully. "Let me see that dog!" exclaimed Frank Wiley III in a strange, grave voice. He pushed the frantically excited Kiki from the bed to the floor. He drew back the covers from the little dog, huddled apprehensively against young Frank's thin body. "Oh, good Lord, it's incredible! It just isn't possible!" "Isn't it?" snapped his wife, looking with distastefully wrinkled nose at her husband's chalky face, wide, staring eyes. "Well, here it is, and out it goes. Ring for Mason, Frank, at once. I want this dirty little mongrel out." Without paying the slightest attention, her husband turned to Miss Beaver. As he did so, his staring eyes fell upon the ornate plush album on the foot of the bed. "How did that get here?" he demanded. "Old Mr. Wiley brought it last night," admitted Miss Beaver, who was feeling a trifle indignant at the old gentleman's defection. "Old Mr. Wiley?" echoed Dr. Parris stupidly. For him, Miss Beaver thought, old Mr. Wiley? Frank Wiley III, his voice shaky, almost shouted at her. "Do you mean to stand there and tell me that old Mr. Wiley was here and brought that album?" "I may as well tell you now as ever," snapped Miss Beaver, and deliberately turned her back on Mrs. Frank, addressing herself pointedly to Dr. Parris and the boy's father. "The old gentleman has been in here every night to see Frank since I've been on duty, and he brought his little dog, and in my opinion his little dog should get the credit of any improvement in the patient's condition." Frank Wiley III picked up the bulky volume and began turning the thick cardboard pages. His hands trembled. His face was queerly pasty. "Turn the pages yourself, nurse, will you? See if you can find old Mr. Wiley's picture." Miss Beaver flipped the cardboard pages one after another until a familiar face looked quizzically at her from a faded old daguerreotype. She put her finger triumphantly on it. "Here he is. This is old Mr. Wiley." Mrs. Frank tiptoed nearer, took a single look, and then with a shrill scream fainted into Dr. Parris's convenient arms. He muttered under his breath, "Superstitious damsel, this." Of Miss Beaver he asked dryly, as he deposited his fair burden distastefully in the big chair where the old gentleman had been sitting on his nightly visits, "My dear Miss Beaver, are you very certain old Mr. Wiley has been dropping in of nights?" "Of course I am," declared Miss Beaver indignantly. "Is it so astonishing that I recognize a face I've been seeing now for 3 consecutive nights?" "This is unbelievable," Frank Wiley III gasped. Said the doctor gravely, "I ask you to be so very certain, nurse, because the original of that picture has been dead for over 15 years." As those astonishing words fell on Miss Beaver's ears, she turned from the doctor in sheer resentment. "I don't care for practical jokes," she said with dignity to the boy's apparently stupefied father. "And I must say I resent being made sport of. I tell you plainly that old Mr. Wiley, the man in the picture," and she tapped her finger impressively on the album page, "has spent a couple of hours with Frankie and me every night since I've been on duty here. And that's that." "Then that's settled," exclaimed the boy's father in a loud and determined voice. "The dog stays." As if miraculously restored, Mrs. Frank sprang to her feet. "Is that so? Well, my dear husband, I'm afraid you're sadly mistaken. The dog goes." She gave her husband glare for glare, the rouge standing in 2 round spots on her white face. His look was one of active dislike. "We'll see about that, Florrie. All of you, come out into the hall. I want you to see something. Then let anyone say Frank can't keep that dog." He beckoned imperatively, and they followed down the great staircase into the great hall below, where he stopped under a gilt-framed oil portrait, life size, his finger pointing significantly. Miss Beaver deciphered the small label at the front of the massive frame. The painting was a portrait of Frank Wiley I, the founder of the Wiley family. Her eyes rose higher to really look at the picture for the first time since she had been in the house. It was the living likeness of old Mr. Wiley, and it almost seemed to her that as she stared one of the eyelids quivered slightly, as if in recognition of her belated admiration for his diplomatic procedure. Beside him on the painted table one of his fine hands lay negligently, or rather seemed to be lying higher than the table proper, resting on, was it just bare canvas? "Look for yourself, Florrie. Where is the fox terrier that was painted sitting on the table under grandfather's hand?" Young Mrs. Wiley stared pallidly at the likeness of the founder of the Wiley clan. White paint, she conjectured. Then, peering closer at the canvas, somebody scraped the paint off where the dog used to be. Stiff and grim, his own man now, her husband faced her. "Does my boy keep that dog?" Behind them sounded a low exclamation. At the head of the staircase stood young Frank, the puppy tucked securely under one arm. "Nobody's going to take away my little dog that great-grandfather Wiley brought me," cried the lad stoutly, black eyes flashing, thin face determined and unyielding. "Don't let that dog come near me!" screamed Mrs. Frank, and went into a genuine attack of hysteria. He isn't real." Dr. Parris exchanged a look with Miss Beaver, whose face was pale but contented. "I always knew you were a psychic," he whispered, brows drawn into a puzzled scowl. "That's how the old gentleman, God rest his wistful soul, could get through." "I wondered that he never spoke a single word. Now that it's over, I think I'm going to faint," decided Miss Beaver shakily. "Nonsense!" snapped the doctor with scant courtesy. "But she is well scared, thank God. I hardly think she will interfere much in future with young Frank. And by the looks of him, the boy's father has had his backbone stiffened considerably." "That painted dog," whispered Miss Beaver's tremulous lips. "Eh? Yes, yes, the dog," murmured the doctor too casually. You dared?" uttered Miss Beaver incoherently under her breath. "Not altogether," he protested against her ear. He pointed upward. Miss Beaver's eyes followed that gesture and met the admonitory, inscrutable, but very gratified pictured eyes of old Mr. Wiley. End of Old Mr. Wiley by Fanny Gray Laspina.